Occasionally I say when I begin speaking that I'm kind of in uncharted territory, lessons that are not really in keeping with my normal. And this morning is one of them. And it really stirred the lesson by studying in John 6 and the kinds of things that we were talking about this morning. And when I look around me and I think about the thinking of people, and myself included sometimes, I think we need to correct some of that thinking. I got to thinking about the word essential. And I got to thinking about the word essentials. What is essential, and what is it that we cannot live without? And I got to thinking about how I used to state when I was carrying the mail and I was delivering to apartment buildings that were occupied with people who none of whom worked. They all were on government assistance. They had their utilities paid, their food stamps furnished. They didn't furnish anything. And I got to thinking each one of those units had cable TV. Each one of them had central heat and air conditioner. And now I listen and I hear people now say that, Congress passed a law about the accessibility of the internet and how essential that is. And I get to thinking about all that, and it sometimes makes me stop and think and say, the house that I grew up in did not have indoor plumbing. There was one heated room in the house. And, the old saying is, we were poor, we just didn't know it, because we were happy as a lark and didn't really have any real problems. And everything was great. And I get to thinking about now how that we think of essentials as being what? Television, internet, central heat and air, very dependable transportation that can get us from point A to point B at a mile every minute. That's kind of what we think of when we think of essentials. And I know that all of us, we're not going to look at things as we did, going back. I tell people all the time, when I look back and I hear people talk about the good old days, I'll tell you what I remember the most. And I use this illustration a lot because it's true. The one thing that comes back to me about my childhood, the memory that strikes me the most, is the summertime. When it would be extremely hot and there was no air conditioning. And I can remember as a little small boy, under 6, getting my pillow and a sheet to keep the mosquitoes off of me and going to the front porch and sleeping on the front porch because it's so hot I just couldn't stand it in the house. And that's what I think of most of my childhood when I get to thinking about the good old days and think about how I'd like to go back to them. I think, I'm not too sure I want to. But at the same time, I also realize that we have become very spoiled, very coddled, and as a result of that, we think of things essential that really are not. And it sometimes takes us away from things we need to think about, and that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to look at creation. When God created man, and it's really interesting to think, and we talked about some of the things even in the class this morning that I didn't really plan to, but we did. They came up in discussion. And so I want to ask you the question, how would you define essential? Just think about how you define essential. What would you define as essential? Well, would it not refer to something you cannot live without? You think of all the things that you possess and how many can you not live without? That if you didn't have them, your life would continue. Not nearly as pleasant as it is. It wouldn't be nearly as enjoyable as it is. It would be much more difficult than it is. But what could you not live without? And that kind of got me to thinking too about this. When we think of essentials, what are we talking about? What do we mean by that? What do we mean by essential? When you say, well, this is the essentials, I only have the essentials. What do we mean by that? What is it that we think of when we think of that word? Let me ask you this question. Do you think God is better qualified to define what is and is not essential than you are? If God gave a definition of essential, would he not look at it from the real perspective and not kind of our likes and dislikes perspective? And that would define essential. And I'm not suggesting we give any of the things we have up. I mean, technology is what it is, and we are where we are. But I just think sometimes we need to come to grips with things, because we lose a lot of things because we look at things and define them in a way that they shouldn't be defined. We have a lot of luxuries, not essentials, if you get right down to it. Without question, the creation will answer that question. It's going to tell you right quick what God deemed to be essential. So we're going to kind of go back to Genesis chapter 1 and through 3. Chapter 1 through chapter 3. And not looking at every verse, just looking at various parts within it. You know what's essential in your life? The very first thing that is essential. You may or may not recognize that. You may or may not want to acknowledge that. You may or may not want to admit that. But there's one thing in your life that's essential and you cannot escape, and that's God. You can't. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're an atheist. I don't care if you're an agnostic, that's not too sure about whether God exists or not. But here's the facts. If you're sitting here this morning in this audience as a human being with human consciousness, then think about what he says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Now this is the sixth day, and he said, let us make man after our image, and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female created him. So here's the facts. If God does not exist, neither would you. That's a fact that you can't escape. Now, you might not like to admit it. You might not like to submit yourself to that idea, but that's the truth. The only reason that you're here is because God created mankind. If he had not, you would not be. Now you say, what difference does that make? Well, it makes a lot of difference, because that changes our entire perspective of life. Once we realize that we look around us and we realize that not only did God create us, he created a lot of other things that he deemed to be essential. Chapter 2 and verse 7, he kind of reiterates that and says, the Lord formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And that kind of tells you something. Man can do a lot of things and can build a lot of things. What man cannot do is what God did, and that is breathe into his nostrils the breath of life. You may have a prosthetic leg, but it doesn't have circulation. It doesn't have feeling. It can't do the things that the ones that God creates can. I sometimes say to people, I have 2 artificial hips, and they're good. Now, I'm glad that the technology is there that I can have them. But they're not like the ones God gave me. And they don't do the things that God gave me, and they will never be the equal. So you just think about God. And if God hadn't given me the first one, man would have no idea how to make the second one. So you go on and you just realize God's there. And people have to accept that. Well, what did God say was essential? Well, first thing he said, you live in this old body that we talk about, you call your house. And you have to have food. So in chapter 1, verse 29, God said, I'm going to provide that. And as I said in the class this morning, didn't intend for that to come up, but it did. When you plant a garden, you plant a seed. That's great. You do a lot of work. A lot of work. But here's the fact. God said, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. The idea is that seed, whose seed is in itself, is something that God produced. So again, when you begin to look at all these things and what's essential, what's the one common denominator you see every time? God. And if you take God out of the picture, then the essentials are no longer. You know, water. Water is something that, as far as I understand, I've listened to a lot of scientists speak, when they look at Mars, any other planet, they say, if there's no water, there's no possibility of life. And so you look out there and there's no water, there's no life. That's what they tell us. I assume they're right. After all, what is the earth mostly? Well, the earth is 75% covered by water. That's the truth. And God realized it, so he provided it for us. You look at it. In chapter 2 and verse 6, what did he do? It didn't rain at the time, evidently. And so there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. What happens when you have a drought? What's the real serious issue? Water. And what if you don't have it? And what can man do to provide it? Not much, because he's still dependent on God. I mean, whether we like it or not, if you're an atheist, an agnostic, or a strong believer, and you're a farmer, you are totally dependent on God, because the rain is what you have to have for sustenance, and if it doesn't happen, you don't happen. So again, you come back. Can you separate those essentials from God? You know, it's interesting that Tim mentioned work in his prayer. People say, well, why would you pray for work? I mean, can you imagine that if the Lord hadn't provided this principle, what would happen? The Lord said you need to work. The Lord took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. Why? Because it provided his essentials. So would you consider work to be essential? What if you decide work's not essential and you decide you're going to do nothing? You're going to go home, sit in a chair, and never move. You won't last long. We need to realize that the Lord defines for us things that are essential. Now you say this is kind of a crazy lesson, a little bit, but it's trying to get us to understand something. What are we dependent on? You know, we don't like rules. People say, oh, I wish there wasn't any rules. I used to have a fellow that worked for me, and he was always saying, well, I just think, he was talking about the speed limit. He said, I think I'll be able to drive whatever speed I want to. Have no rules. And I said, okay. Suppose we decided you can drive on either side of the road you want to. It'd be kind of a problem. You have to have some rules. You have to have some laws to govern you. Nature has laws. I mean, you look at the astronauts, and they pick up a banana and the thing floats off into space. And you say, that's great. Don't have to worry about gravity. It'd be kind of a problem when you get right down to it. The problem is that God gave us rules. He gave us laws to follow. He gave them, he said, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. There's a rule. You know why? Because in the day you eat of it, you're going to die. So he said, you know, I want to prevent you from that, so I'm going to give you a rule and it will prevent your death. Just don't eat of it. Essentials. Things that you can't live without. Companionship. God looked at man and said in chapter 2 and verse 18, he said, it's not good that man should be alone, so I'll make him a meet suitable for, help meet for him. Or suitable for him, as some translations read. And there's where marriage, of course, came from. Because after all, at that time, he created man, he by himself. Now he created woman, and so the man has companionship, the woman has companionship, and they have that. Most people, I mean, you just think of the Robinson Crusoe and other things that are based on that book, and think about how important that is. God kind of considered that there needs to be some interaction there. That's something that we really need. That without, we're going to have a serious problem. Homes. You know, one of the things that the Soviet Union did is many years ago, back in the 50s and 60s, they decided, because they were basically becoming an atheistic country, and they decided that homes weren't necessary, and that you actually could breed children just like you breed cattle, and just raise them in a controlled environment like you do cattle, and everything work out. And they tried it. Didn't work well. Didn't work well. Total disaster. We're kind of learning that today, because now we have parents who decided we don't want to raise their children either. We just turn them loose, do what they please. doesn't work well. Homes need to be there, and God designed that. In verse 19 through 24 of chapter 2, he talks about that. He brought the woman to man, and he created the home. And he said, this is now bone of my bones, Adam did, and flesh of my flesh. And he repeated the truth because Jesus repeated this as being from God. She shall be called woman because she's taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And for all that man says today and tries to undermine the home as much as he possibly can, every society in this world has a basic building block, and it's always the same. It's the home. And when that home suffers, that society suffers. Now, all that says what? When you get down to it, what are you really saying? What you're really saying is that God is really the one that's important. I mean, the real problem what we have is, if we're going to continue, we have to know where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going in almost any setting. And that's true in this life. And our problem is we get lost quite often because we don't know where we came from. We don't have any idea about God. We don't know why we're here, to follow the rules and follow the instruction he gives us to be prepared for the next life, because we don't realize there is a next one, as we talked about in class this morning. And the third thing is we have to know something about why we're here, and we have to also know where we're going. You know, just wandering aimlessly through life, what is the one thing you tell your children over and over and over? You better decide what you want to do and do it, because if you just wander aimlessly, you never reach a destination. God knew that. He tells us we have to know where we came from. God created us. We have to know why we're here, to please him. We'll talk about that in a moment. And we have to know where we're going. And in Genesis 3, and I'm not going to read all those verses, it talks about the sin that was committed and how that eventually God actually said to them that, you know what? There are consequences for not following the rules. You forget who created you. You forget why you're here. You forget where you're going, and you're going to have a problem. And it's something we need to realize. Now, let's think about that. Does that match what we think is essential? The book of Ecclesiastes has always fascinated me. It is a book that I've been totally fascinated by. One Sunday, many years ago, I had a sermon in which I did something really different. I just read the book of Ecclesiastes. I didn't really make hardly any comments at all. I just read it. That was the Sunday morning sermon. You ought to read it. You ought to read it. It's an interesting book, because you know what it talks about? It talks about essentials. It talks about what really is essential. Because what did the wise man do? He tried everything. He decided entertainment was essential. I can't live without it. I got to have with cable TV. Didn't have cable TV at the time, but he had other kinds of entertainment, so he just threw himself into it. You know what he finally ended up saying? This is all vanity and vexation of spirit. And then he decided material possessions are really important, so he built houses, he planted gardens, he made beautiful structures. And he got through with all that, and he stepped back and he looked at it and he said, that's just vanity and vexation of spirit. And he goes down the list and he says, I tried everything I could imagine to say, what can I find that's going to bring me some real sense of purpose and why I'm here? And he said, having problems with that. Don't understand, because whatever I try, I find it to be vanity and vexation of spirit. I'm reminded of what Job said. You know, when Job lost everything he had and his wife came to him, and or rather the people came to him, and he said this. He rose, he looked at the situation, and he said this. Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. I don't understand the whole situation, but I know one thing. There's one thing essential in my life, my relationship with God. The rest of it, plays a part in it. God gave me those things to demonstrate my dependence on him, But in reality, the one thing I can't get away from is my relationship with God. Well, you know, it's kind of strange. You look at that statement by Job, and then you think about old Solomon. He goes and he writes the book of Ecclesiastes talking about his life. And if you ever read his life, you see it's pretty well good description of it. Look at 1 Kings, or rather 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Or rather 1 Kings, 1 Chronicles, I'm sorry. But when you look in Ecclesiastes 12 and 13, when he gets to the whole end of this, and you have to realize that what he's doing in the book of Ecclesiastes is he's trying to reach the conclusion, what is essential? What is it I can't do without? What is it that I must have? And I'm trying to find it, and so far I hadn't really located it. And he said, you know, here's the truth. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, the simplest passage you've ever read. Here's the conclusion. Fear God and keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. Interesting thing is, in the King James translation, you'll see an italicized word sometimes. Duty is there italicized, which means it's supplied by the translators to make the meaning more clear. I think they really made it less clear. Because here's the truth. You know what he really said? If you fear God and keep His commandments, you will be a whole man. If you don't, you won't. That's what he really said. What he's saying is God is the essential. And He's the one thing, everything else is tied to it. And there are things that demonstrate that. The air you breathe, the food you eat, the water you drink. Yeah, because why? Because that came from God. You don't have control over it. You don't really, you say, well, I had something to do with it. I dug a well. Yeah, but who put the water under the ground? You know, you have to realize that in the long and the short of it, as Job would say, God created you, you didn't have a single solitary thing. He gave you the things to support this old house you live in while you're here on this earth. But when this old house is gone, you're still going to be back in the same position you were. I preached a lesson many years ago, preached it more than once. Preached it twice here, I think. And it talks about our lives. We're born as a baby. God created us. We know nothing else. We live our life and we add things to our life. There are people, relationships, things, all that. But when we get to the end of our life, we're going to be right back where we started from. God created us. It was just us and God. Now it's just us and God. So what's essential? Well, what's essential is that relationship with God. You know, Jesus, sometimes people say, well, this idea of essentials, you kind of stretch it a little bit. No, I don't think so. I'm not saying that you stop working. I'm not saying you stop having some concern over physical things, because you have to. I mean, not much more pitiful than seeing a person who gets to the point they don't care about themselves and they just sit around and squalor and just don't do anything, don't contribute anything. It is a little irritating. But on the other hand, we can get to the point that we like this fellow who says, the only thing that's important to me is my money, so Jesus, will you help me secure it? And Jesus said, take heed, beware of covetousness. And then he made this statement. You think about it very seriously when you think about essentials. For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. You think today about what really is essential. When you die, you're going to find out what is. When you pass from this life and you breathe your last breath, then you'll understand what's essential. How many cars did you own? Be interested to know how many Jay Leno owns. I have no idea. I saw him the other day on a fire truck. Antique fire truck. Warehouses full of them. When he dies, will he have one? He won't have one. He'll have a 6 by 8 hole in the ground, a 4 by 8 hole in the ground about 6 foot deep, and that's going to be it, like all the rest of us, unless it's cremated, then he won't even have that. But you thought and think of what he's saying and what we're getting at. You know, we think of essentials. Well, essentials, I can't do without that. Well, sometimes we can do about a lot of things that we don't realize we can. The Apostle Paul, he talked about learning. You know, that's something we talked about in class this morning a little bit. Learning. We have to learn things. He said, I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again. I'm glad you're helping me out. I'm here in prison. I need some help. Wherein you were not also careful, but you lacked opportunity. But then he said this. Not that I speak in respect of want. It's not that I couldn't live without it. That it would be a catastrophe it didn't exist. I'm glad to receive it, but like all the other blessings received from God. But here's what he did say. I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I'm instructed, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I help to support a veterans cause. It's called Troopathon. You know what they do? They send cookies and foot powder to soldiers in foreign places. And you say, well, that's not a big deal. Go there and be without it and see how big a deal it is. Is it essential? No. I mean, a soldier can go on without an SP pack, as we used to call them. Supplemental provisions. You can go on without it. In the long run, I look at it as being something I can give them that makes it a lot more pleasant. But what is the greatest gift you can give anyone? To preach the gospel to them so that they can find eternal security. We need to learn. The essential is God. Does real happiness result when we ignore God? We have a society that pretty much ignores God, don't pay attention to God. God doesn't mean anything to them. They don't care. I mean, look at the advertisement on television. I mean, not only do they not very often speak of God or give any credit to God, many of them are actually in opposition to the idea of any responsibility to a greater power than myself. And so we kind of get this idea that we're going to find real happiness, and people write all these books about real happiness. And I'm going to tell you something. In the final analysis, you try and give this answer, are you going to find real happiness? Real happiness. There's something there that's real. Not artificial, but real. Are you going to find it if you take God completely out of the equation, you don't consider God at all, and you don't put him in there at all? It's a little bit of a lengthy reading. I want to read it. He said, if thou sayest the oppressor of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a providence, marvel not at that matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. Tomorrow we'll have a new president that will be sworn in. A president of the United States is often referred to as the most powerful person in the world. Maybe an apt description. If you use another word, the most powerful human being in the world. But if you view God as a person, the President of the United States is not the most powerful person in the world. Is not, has never been, and will never be. Because what did he say? He said, there be that's higher than they. Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. And he said, even if you look at a king, a president in our case, and you think of how great he is, what if there were no farmers? He'd starve to death. That's his point. And who provided the seed for the farm? God. And if you go on, he said, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver. Nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. Right now we have men in the world, the richest man in the world, what, $700 billion? Is that right? I believe that's right. Pretty close. Somewhere between 5 and 700 billion. How many dollars could you spend in a day? I watched a movie one time with Eddie Murphy in it, and the movie was, we're going to give you so much money, if you can spend so many dollars a day, we'll give it to you. And he just couldn't do it. I mean, he just couldn't do it. had some limits on what you could do and just couldn't get there. So in the final analysis, how much money is enough? How much money is enough? You think about in the United States, they tell us in today's world that you can't buy a house unless your average household income on average in the United States is at least $175,000 a year. You really can't buy a house. Not true in every society, but they're taking into account California, New York, and Tennessee, and Florida, and Kentucky, and the whole works. And they're lamenting the fact that just a few years ago it was $55,000 a year you could buy a house, now it's $175,000. Well, how much money is enough? Is that $175,000 enough? You can buy a house, you'd be pretty comfortable. Does man think like that? No, doesn't really. If you look at Elon Musk, and he's kind of thinking about now buying other businesses, and he added just recently, I can't remember, $100 billion to his, what difference does it make? Make him any happier? He said, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, and he that loveth abundance will increase. This is also vanity. And he goes on to say, when goods increase, they increase that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them? You can just look at them and say, okay, this is my net worth. Big deal. Whoopee. The sleep of a slumbering man is sweet. And whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich man will not suffer him sleep. There's a sore evil which I've seen under the sun, namely riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. For those riches perish by evil travail, and he begetteth the son, there is nothing in his hand. As he cometh forth of his mother's womb, next shall he return, as Job said, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he may carry in his hand. This also is a sore evil, that in all points, as he came, so shall he go, as we already spoke of, and what profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? Can't catch it. All his days also he eateth in darkness, and hath much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. The real happiness come when you ignore God and pay no attention to Him, don't want Him part of my life. Does it? Now stop and think about that. You consider the rich man. In Luke chapter 12, and it's one of the most famous parables that you've ever read. Probably read it many, 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 many times. It began with this question about inheritance, and we've already talked about it in verse 15. Man's life consists of not the thing of ground with abundance. It talks about this rich man has all this land, produces all these wonderful crops. And he said, what am I going to do? Well, I'll just pull down my barns, build greater. And that wasn't particularly a problem, but the problem was what he said in verse 19. That's where the problem lies. The problem lies in this. Sow thou as much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But you remember what we talked about? What is the real essential? Remember what we said? God. So what do you read in verse 20? This man said, oh, I've got all this and I'm in great shape. And God said, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall these things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So if you come down to it and you ask a question, what's essential? One thing's essential, everything else is disposable. And that's God. And your relationship with Him. And if you don't have a relationship with God, then your life becomes a meaningless experiment. In the 6th chapter of the book of Matthew, there's part of this that you recognize immediately, some of it you don't as much. But in the 6th chapter of the book of Matthew, in the midst of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, beginning there in verse 24, no man can serve two masters. Now, He didn't say that you can't be involved in this world because you're here. He didn't say you don't have to go to work because you do. It's part of the thing you have to do in order to support yourself. He didn't say you have to pay some attention to these things because you have to. You can't just pay no attention to them because then you'll just completely collapse physically. But one of them has to be your master. Which is it? Which is your master? Is it your physical possessions or relationship with God? Is it God? Which is it? You have to decide. One of them has to win over the other. And that's what Jesus is discussing in this particular passage, and here's what he said. Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, and yet for your body, what you shall put on, for life is not more than the meat, and the body than the raiment. Now, he didn't say that you don't make plans or you don't plant crops. That's not what he's saying. He's saying you can't become overly concerned about it and just go berserk. Because he said if you look out and you look at the birds, well, they don't toil, they don't sow, and God feeds them. Just like he feeds you, by the way. You do toil and sow, but God's the one responsible for what takes place because he set forth the laws by which you live. And he goes on to say, when you think of yourself, I told somebody yesterday that actually last night at supper, and I used to say this a lot in preaching, don't say it much anymore, but I used to say, when I got to the age that I looked at the National Football League and I saw that there wasn't a single person there that was as old as I was, it made me very sad because as a child, my dream was to play football in the National Football League. And I said at that time, well, that dream is officially over. There's nobody there at that age. I'm too old. You say, that's crazy. But that's the way we people think. We have things in our life that we dream about as a child. We may not ever become them, but we dream about it. But does it make it so? Can I do anything to make it so? You know what my biggest problem was? Slow as Christmas and too light and played an offensive and defensive line position. I couldn't make myself faster and I couldn't make myself heavier in the way that they would need me to be. I might could have become big and fat, but that really wasn't going to solve the problem. So which of you, when you think about it, can you change anything? Who is ultimately going to make those decisions? Going to be God. And so he goes down there when he gets to verse 33, and we're not going to read it all. He does say in verse 30, he talks to us, says, oh, you have little faith. You get so excited about this, and you get so tore up about this world, and you don't realize that, hey, don't take any thought. Because here's what you have to realize. All these people who don't have any relationship with God, that's what they think about. But here's what you need to do in verse 33. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Sometimes we misunderstand verse 34. Take therefore no thought for the morrow. For the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient to the day is the evil thereof. A lot of people say, well, don't make any plans for the morrow. Just kind of drift through life and pay no attention. That's not what he said. I mean, Jesus talked about which of you don't sit down and count the cost. You get ready to build a tower if you have sufficient to finish it. So he's not saying you don't ever make any plans. He's just saying you have to recognize something. You don't control those plans. You don't control. I have a house that I've been trying to start since back in August. There's been one obstacle after another obstacle after another obstacle. Hadn't started it yet. And now we got a little concrete in the ground and we're ready to put the blocks down. Not going to start this week either because the temperature is just way too cold. So who really answers those questions about what we're going to do and what we're not? Can I fuss at God and say, well, I'm mad at you? You think God really cares about that? Would he really be dissuaded because of my anger at him? You go back and look at Job, the 4th chapter, and you'll find the answer to that. The truth is that when you think about essentials, there's only one. If God were not there, you would not be. And if you do not submit yourself to him, you will not reach your potential of living eternally with him. That's really what's essential in this life. I'm not saying all the other things you shouldn't pay some attention to. You have to. Even the disciples were fishermen. And that's not a problem. Even Paul was a tent maker, even while he was preaching the gospel and devoted to Christ. But ultimately, what's essential? Your faith in relationship with God. You know, we often talk about the day of Pentecost. It was talked about in Bible class this morning. Those people were told to repent and be baptized for the remission of sins. And it says in verse 41, rather than a nondescript verse, Now they that gladly received his word, you know what that means? That means those who put the priority there. Those who said, the essential is me pleasing God. Yeah, it's going to hinder my relationship with these Jews and probably my livelihood and maybe even my public safety. But my relationship with God is more important than that. It's kind of interesting, the song we've selected, Zion's Call. You know, you think about being called. And when you're called, you have to make a decision. Is your priority to God? If it is, then you're going to pay attention to it. And you're going to come to him and be submissive to his will. Think of that as together we stand as we sing.